Prologue, Nocturnal Meeting. Grigory Nictopoulos was visibly nervous. It was an unusual sensation for him, and that made him even more nervous. It was nighttime and the man was silently waiting on the border between Kadak Academy and the garden of the house that had once belonged to Professor Hopper, the Hermitage. Behind him was a barrier of planks separating the park from the garden. In front of Grigory, a veritable jungle of trees so tall that they seemed to claw at the sky with their branches, hiding the school buildings from his sight. The man sighed. Beneath his right armpit he could clearly feel the weight of his gun, a large desert eagle so powerful it could take down a rhinoceros with a single bullet. He carried his hunting knife and 4 hand grenades attached to his belt, while the cartridge belt of a machine gun sat diagonally across his chest. He was armed enough to take on an army. But this night, he wasn't awaiting any ordinary army. Grigory listened intently. From the school hidden behind the curtain of vegetation came the sounds of battle, shouting, and the explosions of many windows being shattered to smithereens. He increased his grip on the leash he held in his left hand, and observed the 2 dogs lying by his feet, Hannibal and Scipio, his enormous Rottweilers, muscular, heavy beasts with bad tempers who he had personally raised to become wild combat animals. But they were now both lying on the ground, close together and with their muzzles resting between their front legs. They were very scared. All of a sudden, the dogs leapt up, turned their mouths towards the scrub and began to make a hoarse growl in unison. Grigory drew the leash back to keep them at bay. After several moments, he started to hear something. It was a deep sound, like metal moving through mud, heavy steps made by something inhuman that was advancing towards them from between the trees. The man placed a hand on the butt of his gun, better to be safe than sorry. Finally, the first soldier arrived from beneath the trees. It was easily 2 meters tall, and as solid and imposing as an armoire that had been lifting weights at the gym. It wore shiny bronze armor, and its face was a blank, dark metal mask with a series of yellow lights that glowed in at regular intervals. From its head came a waterfall of black cables that ended in electrical plugs. Hannibal and Scipio both let out a few barks and jumped behind Grigory with a single bound, pressing themselves against his legs. Grigory didn't want to show his fear in front of the scary being, and so he cleared his throat before speaking to it in the driest way he could manage. "Did you bring what we asked for?" was all he could say. The soldier gave no sign of having heard him and simply passed by him, moving through the barrier towards the hermitage. The man realized that the creature's steps seemed less sure and shakier, and its armor was even less shiny than usual. It seemed to be becoming translucent, like a ghost. More soldiers exited the trees. They marched in double file and only the row of small, yellow lights across their helmets animated their inexpressive faces. Some of them were as solid and compact as mountains, while others seemed intangible. Grigory noticed that their breastplates were covered in strange chemical substances, and their imposing armor had some holes here and there. The battle must have been harder than initially expected. One of the soldiers approached Grigory and held out its hand, offering him a palm computer not much larger than a regular mobile phone. Its screen was lit up. "Thank you," said Grigory, taking the device. Without response, the soldier reunited with its peers and continued its march towards the Hermitage's basement. There, the scanner column would swallow them up, making them disappear forever. Grigory now felt calmer. Once their mission was complete, the soldiers created by Xana would auto-destruct, just like they had planned. He tugged on Hannibal and Scipio's leashes to convince them to get up, and walked through the barrier with them, entering the Hermitage's backyard. The house was a narrow, 3-story construction, with a gable roof. On its left, a garage with a flat roof sat against one of the side walls. The sliding door was open and the creatures marched in this direction to access the basement. Grigory turned to 2 human soldiers, who had frozen at the abnormal sight of the robot parade and let out a crazed, hoarse laugh. "Don't worry, children," he said in a mocking tone. "Those boogeymen won't hurt you. Haven't you seen their armor? They're becoming transparent." One of the soldiers tried to babble something in response but Grigory shrugged. "Once they've come through," he ordered them, "immediately close the barrier. And don't forget to warn me if anything weird happens." This said, the man and his 2 dogs walked around the side of the house. The pickup was parked on the road, outside the front door. It was red and seemed rather beaten up, but beneath the rickety facade hid a veritable race car. Grigory had tuned the motor himself. The man climbed in and sat Hannibal and Scipio on the ample back seat. He then sat in the driver's seat, breathing heavily as he took the palm computer the soldier had delivered to him. He observed the incalculable mess of numbers and other characters that shone against the black screen. Grigory didn't understand one iota of it all, but he did recognize one word that flashed in the upper left. Part of the mishmash, Aelita, the name of Hopper's daughter. It remained to be seen why Hannibal Mago was so interested in this thing. Grigory hadn't the slightest idea, but during the many years he'd spent working for the man, he had learned one thing: it's better to ask few questions, keep your eyes open and always have a way out. He took out a flash drive from the glove box and connected it to the palm computer, registering a copy of the device contents. It was a mere precaution. Maybe, on the day when he least expects it, Mago will turn his back on him and this data, whatever it may be, will be more useful to him. Grigory turned and distractedly stroked his two dogs. "Come on, my pretties," he whispered to them. "Best not to keep Mago waiting." Chapter 1, The Morning After the Battle. Eva Skinner felt very lucky. Firstly, she looked truly sensational. The fuchsia makeup on her eyelids went perfectly with her blue eyes, and the shine on her lips made her small mouth look like a heart. She wore a splendid fluorescent green jacket and boots that couldn't be any more fashionable. Oh, if only her friends could see her now. In front of her was a small, crystal lake surrounded by a small wood of glass trees. One of the trees stretched and bent like a willow, and from its branches ran drops of water in all the colors of the rainbow, raining on the surface of the lake like an ethereal waterfall. Eva was in a park, the park of a marvelous and deserted city, of which she was the one and only queen. What more could she ask for? Well, of course, not everything was perfect. Starting with the strange boys she had met here. The first, who says his name is Ulrich, was a cute and athletic boy. But he was dressed in a very tragic way, like a samurai, with his traditional sword attached to his belt. The other was even worse. He was called Jeremy, and he wore a pair of very large and round glasses, had very pointy ears, wore horrible green tights and seemed like the ugly cousin of an elf. Eva couldn't remember how on earth she had agreed to go walking with guys like that. She was a girl of a certain social standing, and, without a doubt, the prettiest girl at her school. She turned around. Jeremy and Ulrich were seated cross-legged on the bank of the small lake and were talking to one another animatedly. They spoke in French. Although she considered speaking French a very chic thing to do, Eva had never found the time to study it. However, to her enormous surprise, she could now understand everything. It was as if a part of her brain was automatically translating their words into English, and in truth, that is very strange. Eva shrugged before approaching the two boys. There was nobody in this city apart from the three of them, so she would be better off getting along with them. Jeremy, Ulrich, and Eva were in the park of the first city, and it had been several hours since they had heard news from the outside world. Jeremy had tried to explain to Eva why she was here, including the story about Xana and everything else, but the girl seemed more interested in her clothes than his words, and so he had given up after a short while. He had more urgent matters to think about. They had to find a way to get out of the first city and rematerialize in the real world. "What do you think's going on out there?" Ulrich asked him, a worried expression on his face. Yumi was still in reality, where Xana had sent an army of monstrous creatures. "I'm sure that Yumi and Odd are managing on their own," Jeremy said, trying to smile. "Richard and Professor Hertz are with them, not to mention the principal and our parents. And I believe Aelita is safe and sound in the mirror. Her father's journal is a tranquil place with no dangers." "You're forgetting about Xana," Ulrich pointed out. "Xana is with her." Jeremy felt a shiver rise up his spine. That was the thought he had been trying his best to avoid. "Xana is here too, with us," he responded. "He has already retaken his place as the absolute master of Lyoko and the first city. And, even so, he hasn't attacked us yet." "So," exclaimed Ulrich, "we stay here and wait? But sooner or later, he might set his monsters loose to tear us to pieces, and then," Jeremy clicked his fingers, his face brightening with joy. "You're right," he exclaimed. "Right? About what?" asked Ulrich, staring at him in confusion. "About Xana's monsters. If we provoke them and they attack us, we'll lose our life points, and, But, have you gone crazy? Don't you remember our battles on Lyoko? Without life points, The game is over and we go back to reality. We'll materialize in the factory scanners and we'll be safe again. The factory is infested with the Green Phoenix terrorists, Ulrich responded, unconvinced. How on earth are we going to get out of there? I don't know, admitted Jeremy. But there's always a way to get out of something like this, right? He realized that Eva had stopped looking in the mirror created by the pure water in the lake. The girl returned to them and smiled. Instead of staying here and arguing, why don't you accompany me on a tour? I'd like to explore this fantastic place. Eva had just spoken in French, though with a very strong American accent. Jeremy told himself that this girl may be brighter than she appeared. Della awoke feeling as cold as ice and with the sensation of having bruises on every square centimeter of his skin. At first he had thought that sleeping on the science laboratory floor would have been fun, but he hadn't taken the hard tile floor into account. What's more, it was incredibly cold. The previous night, Odd had been forced to cut the power to all the school buildings to stop their enemies from recharging their batteries. It had been a smart idea, because it had saved them all. But it had also disabled the thermostat and now the boiler was inactive. Odd poked his head out of his sleeping bag. The morning light had begun to filter through the large laboratory windows. There was a jumble of desks, tables, and microscopes lined up along the walls, while in the middle area, which had been completely cleared of furniture and apparatus, in the faint light Odd could see the silhouettes of Cadix students, sleeping in their bags, over which they had thrown quilts and blankets they had found around the school. The principal was there too, as well as the teachers and a few parents, Ulrich and Jeremy's fathers, Yumi's parents, and his own, Robert and Marguerite Della Robbia. All together like a family on a camping trip. Except that they weren't out camping, they were at war. Yumi, whose sleek black hair was spread all over the pillow, was still asleep beside him. She must have been exhausted. During the battle that night, she had fought like a true warrior. The girl opened one eye at that moment and began to laugh. What is it? Odd immediately asked her. Your hair, it looks ridiculous. Odd had long, blonde hair, which he usually gelled up to have it stick up above his head, sort of like a burning flame. But he realized that at that moment, his glamorous hairstyle was a real disaster, all his hair flattened to one side. He must have looked absurd. Nobody panic. I'll fix everything in a fraction of a second, he responded with a smile. Without even looking for a mirror, he smoothed it back into place with a few precise movements. Everyone's still asleep, he then said, looking around. Yumi was now completely awake and climbed out of her sleeping bag. She was wearing a sweatshirt and black jeans. Black had always been her favorite color. Richard's not here, the girl observed. Odd realized that she was right. Their friend's sleeping bag was empty. He glanced at his watch and saw that it was 6 in the morning. Where could he have gone so early? He and Yumi looked at each other. They then left the laboratory without a sound. Cadix Academy was littered with clear signs of battle. All parts of the school were covered in broken glass, electrical outlets torn from the walls, doors removed from their hinges and desks upturned. Odd and Yumi, with Richard, and Sissy, the principal's daughter, had raised the alarm the night before. As soon as they'd seen the robots coming out from the trees, they had run to warn the others. Professor Hertz had prepared smoke grenades and bombs containing corrosive acid, and the children had fought the machines with anything they could get their hands on, baseball bats and football helmets, bows, and arrows, and even a dishcloth and soapy water. Many of the school's students were still in a state of shock, and some of the teachers had to take sleeping pills to get to sleep. For Yumi and Odd, however, it was different. They had never seen robots like the ones from last night, but they had immediately noticed the symbol the monsters had engraved on their armor. It was the mark of Xana, the artificial intelligence that dominated Lyoko. It's going to take us a century and a half to fix everything up, commented Yumi as she looked bleakly around her. Don't tell me you want to waste all your time cleaning the school. Odd responded with a grimace. We have a much more important mission, defeat the Green Phoenix and free our friends. Especially Eva. Yumi couldn't help but smile. Odd was very infatuated with the North American student, and he had been extremely upset to discover that Xana was controlling her body, but obviously, he hadn't completely lost hope. The two children left the building and began to look for Richard. They walked through the garden in the park. caressed by a splendid sunrise, and the trees still laden with dew. They quickly checked the student dormitory and cafeteria, but they found no trace of their friend and decided to try the administrative building. They passed by Professor Hertz's office, which Xana's robots had ravaged, and continued on to the basement. "Do you think Richard is trying to repair the thermostat?" Odd asked Yumi. The girl shrugged, doubtful. "From what I know," she finally responded, "he's studying engineering at university, but I don't get the impression that he's very good at practical stuff." Richard Dupuis was 23 years old, and as a child, he had attended Caddick Academy, just like them. He had been a student of Professor Hopper and classmates with his daughter, Aelita. Except that Aelita and her father had been forced to flee the Men in Black by virtualising themselves onto Lyoko, and she hadn't continued to grow up. While Richard had become an adult. They found him just outside the boiler room, seeming very worried. "Richard," greeted Odd. "How are you, man?" The young man began, shrugging. "I'm looking for my Palm computer. I can't find it anywhere." "You lost your PDA?" Yumi questioned, frowning with worry. "I had it in my pant pocket yesterday, like I always do. When Odd and I cut the power, we were in total darkness here, and so I tried to dig it out to give us some light, and I realized that it wasn't there." "Come on," Odd tried to console him, patting his back. "It can't be that important." "Don't you get it, Odd?" Yumi retorted, fuming. Xana was really controlling Eva Skinner. That means that he would have seen Professor Hertz's file with the codes in it. According to Jeremy, Richard's Palm computer contains the second part of the code down. So if Xana gets his hands on it, Richard and Odd looked at her, eyes wide. They hadn't thought about that. But Yumi had. Something or someone, maybe even Professor Hopper in person, had filled the man's Palm computer with programming code. Jeremy was the group's resident computer genius, and he was adamant that it was important. "Let's get to work," exclaimed the girl. "We need to find this thing." The calendar on the wall showed that the date was the 4th of June, 1994. Aelita was in her father's journal, the virtual world her friends had named the Mirror, and which contained the 6 final days in the life of Professor Hopper before he disappeared inside Lyoko. At that moment, the girl was seated in the Hermitage living room. It was a very orderly room, with a sofa, a lovely rug, and an elegant library. A mirror on a bookshelf reflected her image, an elf with pink hair. Aelita fiddled with the golden necklace around her neck. She caressed the delicate engraving on the surface with her fingertips, a W and an A. Waldo and Anthea, her parents' names. Just below it, a sailor's knot, symbolizing their eternal link. Aelita knew that she was alone. She was a prisoner in the virtual world her father had created as a perfect copy of her past, and she hadn't the slightest idea what to do. Jeremy had almost brought her back to reality, but she had refused. She had chosen to remain here with Xana to try to become his friend again. But she and Xana had then had an argument, and he had left, leaving her here alone. To pass the time, the girl had used the navigation box to go back in time in her father's journal. The mirror recounted a fascinating story. After having fled the military base of Project Carthage and after her mother was kidnapped, her father had sought refuge in Paris under a different name, in order to escape the Men in Black and continue his experiments in secret. And he had succeeded with the help of a scientist, Major Steinbach, who had later become Professor Hertz. They had both placed their trust in Walter when he had provided funding and constructed the supercomputer in an abandoned factory not far from the Hermitage or Caddick Academy. But Walter, the father of her friend Ulrich, had betrayed them. He sold her father out to the Men in Black. Aelita had witnessed the final scene of the journal at least a dozen times. In 1994, to help her father, she had accepted to be the subject of a strange experiment that she remembered absolutely nothing about. Then, the Men in Black had found them and everything had shattered in the blink of an eye. The secret agents had opened fire, injuring Aelita, and in order to save her, her father had fled to Lyoko with her in his arms. For the young girl, seeing these scenes again had been a startling surprise. Aelita had lost all her memories to do with these events. Her brain had erased them as if they had never existed. Why? Could this possibly be linked to what her father did to her in 1994? Aelita had no clue. Letting out a long sigh, she went into the kitchen to drink some water. Her hand went straight through the tap as if it were just an optical illusion. The girl smacked her forehead. How stupid. She rummaged through her clothing and found the mirror box. It was blue in color and had a small screen and 3 large, red buttons. With the 2 side ones she could advance and rewind through time in the journal, while the third, labeled Free Exploration, allowed her to move around the virtual world however she liked. But the command box also had another power. By holding it in her hand, she could touch the objects in the world, use them, and even eat and drink. Like this, Aelita finally succeeded in quenching her thirst, then looked all around the deserted kitchen. She had to do something, find someone, or she would run the risk of going completely crazy. She was tired of being alone. And her friends needed her in the real world. Chapter 2, Richard's Palm Computer. Aelita knew that she was really inside the same computer that housed her friends on Lyoko. But the mirror was located inside of a sandbox, a sort of virtual space completely isolated in the core of the supercomputer that functioned separately from the rest of the content on the hard drive. By building the mirror, her father had had a stroke of genius. He created it by using the memory-snatching device on himself and Professor Hertz, and the events in their memories were perfectly recreated. Aelita had combed the Parisian suburb from one side to the other. She could smell the summer air and hear the buzzing of the mosquitoes, but had managed to find very few people. She could only find the people that her father and Professor Hertz had seen, some only for a few split seconds as they went about their days in 1994. Other than that, the city was empty and desolate. There were no children playing ball in the middle of the street, no workers behind the counters of stores. What a sad place, thought the young girl to herself. But she knew that she would find someone else at Kadak. In the world of the mirror, it was currently more or less 10 o'clock in the morning, and her father, who at this time had been working as a teacher, was surely in class. Aelita crossed the Hermitage garden and strolled through the park towards Kadak. The class would be full of people, young boys, and girls her age, her old classmates. She could sit on the floor and watch her father, listen to his lesson, have some company. Upon arriving at the science laboratory, Aelita discovered that nothing had changed during all these years, except for the computer set up on the desk. The one from 1994 was a large plastic, yellowed box with an enormous, cathode ray tube monitor. Without really understanding why, Aelita recognized the computer model. It was a 486, which, at the time, was the best available. It used a Windows 3.11 operating system, from the prehistoric times of computer science. She wondered what Jeremy would say if he saw it. The young girl then turned red thinking of her friend. She hoped with all her heart that he was doing well. Her father was located behind the desk and was in the process of revealing his secrets on BASIC, a programming language. His students were watching him as if he were a Martian. Aelita discovered that her father taught passionately, enthusiastic about the new technologies that he was explaining. And yet, the Aelita from 1994 sat at her desk with an absent-minded and slightly bored look about her. The young girl observed herself for a moment. The Aelita of 10 years ago was nearly identical to her current self, but she also seemed quite different, more carefree. Beside her at the same desk sat Richard, who was also 12 years old, and they were joking quietly amongst each other, passing notes back and forth. She would have loved to approach the Aelita of 1994 and grab her by the shoulder, telling her to pay attention and listen to the lesson and take advantage of these final moments with her father, but unfortunately, there was nothing she could do. It was nothing more than a recording. Once the class had finished, the students began to leave through the door. Each time that one of them left the room, they disappeared from view and the memories of her father, transforming into smoke and vanishing into thin air, no longer existing. Ultimately, the only ones remaining in the class were her father, Richard, and the Aelita of 1994. "Please, my dear," said Hopper, "leave the classroom. I would like to speak for a moment with Richard." The child shrugged her shoulders and rose with a hop, becoming transparent, then invisible like the others before her. Richard approached the professor, while Aelita did the same. "Did I do something bad, Professor?" the boy asked. Hopper burst out laughing. "Besides not paying attention during my class? Don't worry, you're fine. But, well, I'd like to ask a favor of you." Aelita listened more closely. She had never yet explored this part of the journal. It could be important. Her father passed through her without seeing or feeling her, and he led the young Richard towards the computer at the desk. In the middle of the river was an island that connected to the mainland by an iron bridge. The island had a factory on it, a large building made of red bricks and a steel roof with windows on all sides. The factory and bridge had been there for years, rusting bit by bit without anyone paying them any attention, but for several days now, the place had been brought back to life, reanimated by the soldiers and workers and their constant coming and going. There wasn't much to see on the outside besides the men who were keeping watch in front of the entrance. The inside, on the other hand, had changed a lot. The suspended walkways that linked the entrance to the ground floor had fallen apart quite some time ago, but new mobile platforms had been installed in their place. Everything had been kept clean, the cement ground was free of debris, and the center of the room contained a large, emerald green nomadic tent. Beside the enormous tent was the elevator that led to the 3 underground floors where Hopper had built the enormous structure of the supercomputer. The 3rd floor, the deepest, housed this computer, a tall cylinder covered with golden glyphs that shone in the darkness. On the 2nd level were the scanners that allowed access to the virtual world. And finally, on the 1st level was the command post from which the entire imposing, electronic apparatus could be managed. At the moment, Memory was seated at the controls. The woman seemed to be between 40 and 50 years of age, but the smooth skin of her face and the red cascade of hair that enveloped her made her appear younger. Over her plain jacket, she was wearing a white lab coat, and delicately around her neck sat a simple golden necklace. Several screens full of symbols surrounded the scientist, and in front of her, a sphere was levitating in the air, divided into 4 sectors. It was Lyoko, though obviously only its holographic projection. Hannibal Mago approached Memory silently and placed a hand adorned with many rings on her shoulder. "Well?" he asked. Memory turned around on the pivoting chair at the terminal and looked into his predatory eyes without so much as blinking. "I'm really sorry, sir," she replied. "Still nothing." The woman pointed to the palm computer that was connected with a cable to the analysis systems at the console. "I worked all night non-stop, but these codes, they're unintelligible." Hannibal Mago clenched his teeth. "Do you know what we've been doing up until now, dear? We conquered a fortress. We conducted a long siege, and we'll need years to fully complete this step, but the factory is now ours, and we have reactivated the supercomputer. And we need to start on phase 2 now at this stage, consolidate the success. We must use Lyoko to attack the most important centers of power in the world. And we must do it quick, before our enemies manage to organize themselves." "Yes, sir." Mago placed his hand on Memory's shoulder again, but grasped it this time until a pained expression appeared on the woman's face. "I need to know what these codes do. Is it a weapon that could be used against us? Something from our enemies? Or something that could be exploited in our favor?" I don't know, sir." Mago freed his prey, furious. "Did you transmit the data to that creature, Xana?" he asked in a weary tone. "Of course. He's working on them now, but he hasn't responded yet." Hannibal Mago turned to leave. "I'm giving you until 1 in the afternoon, he said over his shoulder in an icy tone. In the mirror, Professor Hopper and the very young Richard Dupuis were sitting in the lab facing the old teacher's computer, while Aelita was perched on the table and carefully listening to them. "Do you know what electronic mail is?" asked the professor. "It's like regular mail," the boy answered him, while nodding his head. "Like, you have an address and others can send you letters, except they arrive on the computer instead of the mailman bringing them to you." "Exactly," smiled Hopper. "Good, Richard. Well, I've created an electronic mail address for you." The boy's face lit up with a glorious smile. "For me? An email address?" "Yes. And on top of that, it's a very special address. A secret. I will be the only one able to use it to send you messages. So now, listen carefully. If things go the way I think they will, in the near future, electronic mail will develop a lot more, and you could even have dozens of different addresses. So what I'm asking you is that you'll always remember the one that I've given you and that you'll never stop checking it from time to time." Hopper passed a small card to Richard, and Aelita leaned in to see it better. On it was written "Help Aelita@hopper.com" and a long password. The professor saw the look of worry on the child's face and hurried to give him an explanation. "It's a very unique address. The server, in other words, the computer used to save or transmit messages, is mine. It's located in a safe place and will continue to function even some 50 years from now. See what the address says. Help Aelita. You're my daughter's best friend, so if she's ever in danger in the future, maybe even a long time from now, I'll use this email to explain how to help her. Do you promise me you'll use it? Aelita brought her hands to her mouth, stunned. The pieces of the puzzle began to assemble in her mind one after another at the speed of light. Everything must have happened more or less the following way. Richard saved the card from her father and continued to visit the strange email address. When older, he bought a Palm computer that he added all his email inboxes to, this one included. It maybe became a sort of habit for him, an automatic action to check his email that he didn't give much thought to anymore. And then, one fine day, Aelita discovered the secret room hidden in the hermitage. There must have been a switch in the wall or something of the sort. Basically, her father's computer had sent out emails automatically that took control of Richard's Palm computer. The young man hadn't immediately made the connection between this and the promise that he made to her father 10 years before, or perhaps he thought that it wasn't important, but he was pressed either way to visit the hermitage to help her. Richard was someone that they could really count on. During this time, Aelita remained alone in the science lab. Her father and Richard had left. But that didn't matter now. She was still lost in her thoughts. To be honest, her father had really thought of everything. He knew that things could end badly and that Aelita ran the risk of losing her memory, and he prepared a treasure hunt for her, a long series of clues that would lead her to what? She needed to find out. The young girl stood. She knew now what she had to do, find Xana and hope that he would accept to help her.
So, by request, I decided to get started on a new book. Going into book 4 of the book reading. The last of the entries. The one to tie the series all together, at last. It seems that Aelita's mystery with Richard goes even deeper, further cementing that Hopper took every precaution for everyone to have a part in the future. Like he knew everything. But what of Xana? That's what I wanted to find out. And one of my friends commented that one of the fan-made illustrations that there might be unicorns involved. I hope that might come soon, who knows. So, yeah, new episode. I'm excited. And after I finish the book, I'll be remaking the episodes. So, I hope everybody has a good day, and I'll see you all later. See ya.